Imagine this. The year is 420 BCE. The sun is setting over Athens, casting golden light across marble temples and bustling marketplaces. Philosophers debate in shaded colonnades. Citizens gather to vote on the laws of the world's first democracy. This is the birthplace of Western civilization, the cradle of philosophy, art, and reason. But as darkness falls, the shadows reveal something else entirely. Something the history books rarely discuss. Something that existed in plain sight, yet remained hidden behind a veneer of intellectual respectability. What if I told you that the same men who gave us democracy, who wrote treatises on justice and virtue, who built monuments that still stand today, also created an elaborate system of human ownership that would make your blood run cold? What if I told you that behind every celebrated symposium, every philosophical gathering where great minds supposedly debated the nature of love and beauty, there were young boys and men whose entire existence had been reduced to serving the desires of their masters? This is the story that ancient Greece would rather you never heard. This is the life of a male concubine. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This is not about judging an ancient civilization by modern standards. This is about understanding the complete picture of a society we've been taught to idealize. Because you cannot truly understand ancient Greece, its philosophy, its art, its politics, without understanding this hidden world that existed at its very foundation. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't some secret underground practice. It was woven into the very fabric of Greek society. They had specific words for it. They had laws regulating it. They had customs and traditions surrounding it. It was so normalized that philosophers wrote about it, politicians participated in it, and artists immortalized it in pottery and sculpture. But the voices of those who suffered within this system, those voices were systematically erased from history. We have thousands of texts from ancient Greece, thousands, yet almost none from the perspective of the concubines themselves. Their words were never recorded. Their stories were never told. Until now. So settle in. This is going to be a journey through one of history's darkest corridors. A journey that will forever change how you see the ancient world. Let me take you back to the beginning. Ancient Greece was not a unified nation as we understand nations today. It was a collection of city-states, each with its own laws, customs, and social hierarchies. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. These were independent entities, often at war with one another, united only by language, religion, and certain cultural practices. And one of those shared cultural practices was concubinage. Now the Greeks had a very specific term for female concubines. They called them palakidai. The word itself tells us something important. It was a recognized category, a defined social position. In the words of one ancient orator, and I quote, "We have etarai for pleasure, palakai for the body's daily needs, and gynakes for the bearing of legitimate children, and for the guardianship of our houses." End quote. Did you catch that? 3 separate categories of women in a man's life. Prostitutes for entertainment, concubines for daily physical needs, wives for producing legitimate heirs. This wasn't hidden. This was openly acknowledged in legal speeches and public discourse. But here's what most people don't realize. This system didn't just apply to women. It applied to men and boys as well. And in many ways, the fate of male concubines was even more complex, more contradictory, and more devastating than that of their female counterparts. The Greeks had a concept they called pederasty. You may have heard of it. It was the supposedly educational relationship between an older man, called the Erastes, and a younger boy, called the Eromenos. Philosophers like Plato wrote about it in idealized terms. A mentorship. A transfer of wisdom from one generation to the next. The cultivation of virtue and excellence. That's the version you'll find in most history textbooks. But here's what they don't tell you. While this idealized version may have existed in some philosophical circles, the reality for most young men and boys was something far darker. Because alongside this supposedly noble tradition of mentorship, existed another reality entirely. The reality of the male concubine. The catamite. Young men and boys who were not students or protégés, but property, kept not for the cultivation of their minds, but for the gratification of their owners. And this distinction, this gap between the philosophical ideal and the brutal reality, this is what ancient sources tried so hard to paper over. This is the truth that got lost in the cracks of history. So how did a boy become a male concubine in ancient Greece? Who were these individuals who found themselves trapped in this twilight world, between slavery and something even more degrading? The answer reveals the true face of ancient Greek society. Some were prisoners of war. When Greek armies conquered cities and villages, the spoils of war included human beings. Women and children were especially valued. Young boys noted for their beauty were separated from their families, chained together in human caravans, and marched to slave markets where wealthy men would inspect them like livestock. Imagine that for a moment. You are 12 years old. Your city has fallen. Your father is dead. Your mother is screaming as soldiers tear you from her arms. And then begins a nightmare of chained necks and blistered feet. You are no longer a person. You are merchandise. Others came from impoverished families within Greece itself. Families so desperate that they sold their own children to survive. A young boy might wake up one morning in his family home, eating breakfast with his mother, playing in the streets he had known his entire life. And by nightfall, he would belong to a stranger. His childhood over. His future decided by someone else's desires. Still others were slaves born into captivity, never knowing freedom, never knowing any other existence. For these individuals, the concept of autonomy was as foreign as the concept of flight. They were property from their first breath. And then there were the freeborn citizens who fell into concubinage through economic desperation. These cases are particularly tragic because they reveal the hypocrisy at the heart of Greek society. A freeborn boy, perhaps orphaned, perhaps from a family that had lost everything, might find himself with no options, no money, no protector, no future. And so he would enter into an arrangement with a wealthy older man, an arrangement that was technically voluntary, but practically coerced by circumstances. These boys occupied a strange and terrible middle ground. They were not technically slaves. They could not be bought and sold openly. But their economic dependence was so complete that the distinction was largely meaningless. They had traded their freedom for survival. And in doing so, they had given up any hope of ever being seen as respectable members of society. Because here's the cruel irony that defined the life of a male concubine in ancient Greece. The same society that normalized this practice. The same society that created elaborate systems to regulate it. That same society also condemned those who participated in it. Not the wealthy patrons, of course. Not the men who kept concubines. No, they faced little social consequence. The shame fell entirely on the concubines themselves. In Athenian law, a citizen who had been used as a concubine in his youth was considered too degraded to participate in democracy. Think about that for a moment. The legal system that punished boys for having been concubines did nothing to punish the men who made them concubine. The victim was blamed. The perpetrator was protected. This social stigma was perhaps more devastating than any physical abuse, because it meant that even if a male concubine somehow escaped his situation, even if he gained his freedom, even if he acquired wealth and status, he would forever carry the mark of his past. He would forever be seen as less than, effeminate, degraded, unworthy of the respect accorded to proper citizens. The passive role in a same-sex relationship, regardless of whether it was chosen or forced, was considered a profound mark of shame for a free man. And this shame followed you for life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we talk about what happened after, we need to understand what the daily life of a male concubine actually looked like. And I warn you, this is where the story gets truly difficult. Imagine waking up in a house that is not your home. The bed you sleep in belongs to someone else. The food you eat is given to you by someone else. The clothes you wear, if you are permitted to wear any, are chosen by someone else. Every aspect of your existence is controlled by another person. Your patron. That's what they called the owner. The master. He is your Erastes, at least in the language of polite society. You are his Eromenos. But the philosophical terms are a cruel joke. There is no mentorship here. No transfer of wisdom. No cultivation of virtue. There is only service and submission. Your day begins when your patron decides it begins. If he wants you at his side for breakfast, you will be there. If he wants you to wait in your quarters until summoned, you will wait. Your time is not your own. Your body is not your own. Your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, none of it matters. And here's a detail that might surprise you. Many concubines were expected to possess artistic talents. They learned to play the lyre. They learned to sing. They learned to recite poetry. But not for self-expression. Not for the joy of creation. These skills were cultivated to make them more entertaining, more pleasing, more valuable. Imagine mastering a musical instrument, not because you love music, but because your ability to play well determines how you will be treated. Imagine reciting poetry at a gathering of wealthy men, knowing that your performance is not being judged as art, but as another service you provide. Your talents are not celebrated. They are consumed. And then, there were the symposiums. You've probably heard of the Greek symposium. It's often portrayed as an intellectual gathering. A dinner party where philosophers and poets reclined on couches, drinking wine, debating ideas, discussing art and politics and the nature of existence. The birthplace of Western intellectual, that's partly true. But it's not the whole truth. Because at these same gatherings, slaves and concubines served not just food and drink, but themselves. When the wine flowed freely and the guests demanded more intimate entertainment, the intellectual pretensions fell away. What remained was power. Raw, unaccountable power. And the concubines had no ability to refuse. The sources describe sophisticated affairs. Intellectually stimulating conversations between the greatest minds of the ancient world. But they also describe what happened when the stimulation turned from intellectual to physical. And the concubines who served at these gatherings knew that any moment, any gathering, could become something far more degrading than pouring wine. Little did they know the worst was yet to come. Because the symposium was just one part of a male concubine's existence. The private reality, behind closed doors, away from even the pretense of civilized gathering, was far worse. If you were a slave concubine, you had absolutely no rights. Your master could beat you, starve you, sell you to someone worse. If you resisted, you could be punished or killed with no legal consequences. None. The law did not see you as a person. It saw you as property. And property cannot be wronged. Property can only be damaged. Think about that legal framework for a moment. If your patron chose to mistreat you, or even to inflict severe harm, you had virtually no recourse. No avenue for justice. No appeal. Your body was not considered inviolable. You were not seen as a person in the legal sense that mattered for such protections. You were an appendage of your patron, an extension of his property. The sources describe attempts at resistance. Boys who tried to escape, only to be recaptured and beaten so severely that they walked with limps for weeks afterward. Boys who refused degrading orders and were chained in courtyards without food or water for days, exposed to the elements as examples to others. And here's what makes this particularly horrifying by modern standards. The ages. While the exact ages are debated by historians, the evidence points to boys as young as 12 being used as concubines. The idealized age for the younger partner in a pederastic relationship was between 14 and 18. But idealization and reality were often very different things. And for those who were enslaved, the idealization meant nothing at all. 12 years old. Try to hold that in your mind. Try to imagine a 12-year-old, a brother, a son, a nephew, a student. Now imagine that child with no rights, no protection, no escape, subject to the complete control of a wealthy adult man who had purchased him for a specific purpose. This is not ancient history in the abstract. This was the lived reality of countless human beings whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told. who simply disappeared into the silence of the past. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because the Greeks were not monsters who failed to recognize the humanity of others. They were intelligent, sophisticated people who created philosophies and art forms we still study and admire today. They knew what they were doing. They simply created elaborate intellectual frameworks to justify it. The concept of pederasty as education. The idea that the older partner was cultivating the younger partner's virtue. The philosophical discussions of love between men that fill the pages of Plato and other writers. All of this served a purpose. It created a veneer of respectability over what was, in many cases, simple exploitation. And this intellectual cover had consequences. It meant that respectable men could participate in the system without seeing themselves as doing anything wrong. It meant that society could acknowledge the practice without condemning it. It meant that the victims themselves might internalize the ideology and blame themselves for their own degradation. Historians still argue about whether any genuine affection or care could flourish within these relationships. Were there patrons who truly loved their concubines? Were there situations where the power dynamic somehow gave way to something resembling mutual respect? Perhaps. Humans are complicated. Individual relationships surely varied. But the system itself was not designed for affection. It was designed for power. And any tenderness that emerged did so despite the structure, not because of it. Let me tell you about what happened to these boys as they grew older. Youth was everything. Beauty was everything. A concubine's value lay in his youth and appearance, his perceived pliancy, his ability to satisfy desires. But youth fades. Boys become men. And when that happened, the concubine situation became even more precarious. Some were simply discarded, sold off to other owners, often under worse conditions. The downward trajectory of a concubine's life was grimly predictable. Each sale, each transfer brought them to someone less wealthy, less refined, less concerned with even the pretense of respectful treatment. Some transitioned into other roles within their patron's household. Servants, attendants. But the transition was rarely smooth, and the stigma of their former position followed them. Other slaves might view them with a mixture of pity and disdain. They occupied a peculiar space, too degraded for respect, too familiar for anonymity. A few gained their freedom. Wealthy patrons sometimes freed their concubines, perhaps out of genuine affection, perhaps simply because they had no further use for them. But freedom for a former concubine was a complicated thing. Where do you go? What do you do? The skills you developed, the musical ability, the knowledge of how to please, how do you convert those into a respectable life? The sources hint at what happened to many. They simply disappeared from the historical record, suggesting they fell into poverty, into addiction, into early death. The suicide rate must have been significant, though it's never directly addressed in our sources. The philosophers who debated the nature of happiness and virtue apparently did not concern themselves with tracking the fates of discarded concubines. And here's a detail that captures the particular cruelty of this system. Legal documents survive from ancient Greece that describe the rental and sale of boy concubines. Court cases where men sued each other over access to particular boys. Inheritance documents where boys are listed alongside furniture and livestock as property to be passed down. Let me say that again. Inheritance documents. Boys listed alongside furniture and livestock. We can reconstruct the economics of male concubinage from these sources. We know approximately what a concubine cost. We know the factors that affected their value. Youth, beauty, skills, docility. We know that their value depreciated over time, like any other asset. This was not hidden. This was not shameful for the buyers and owners. This was simply how business was conducted in the world's first democracy. And now we come to one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire system: the systematic erasure of the victims' voices. We have thousands of texts from ancient Greece, plays, poems, philosophical treatises, legal speeches, historical accounts, personal letters. A vast treasury of ancient literature has survived the centuries, giving us remarkably detailed insight into how the Greeks thought and lived. But almost none of it comes from the perspective of the concubines themselves. Occasionally, a freedman who had been a concubine might be mentioned in passing. His former status might be referenced as gossip or as a weapon in political disputes. There's even a famous legal speech dedicated to destroying a political rival by revealing he was once a male concubine, describing in detail how the man lived with various older lovers in exchange for gifts and money. But the man's own words, his own perspective on what he experienced, his own account of how it felt to be property, none of that was considered worth recording. This silence is not accidental. It is the deliberate result of a system that did not recognize concubines as full human beings. Their experiences did not matter. Their suffering was not significant. Their voices were simply not heard. And so we are left to reconstruct their lives from the margins. From legal documents that treated them as property. From philosophical texts that debated their status in abstract terms. From comedies that made jokes at their expense. From the occasional reference in historical accounts. We know what was done to them. We know how they were treated, but we do not know what they thought or felt. Their inner lives are lost to us forever, drowned out by the voices of those who owned them. Now, let me take you through the broader social context, because understanding how male concubinage fit into Greek society helps explain why it persisted for so long, and why it was so difficult to escape. Greek society was obsessed with status, citizenship, freedom, masculinity, honor, all. These were not just abstract concepts but practical realities that determined every aspect of daily life. Who could speak in public? Who could vote? Who could own property? Who was protected by the law? Who was not? At the top of this hierarchy were adult male citizens. They enjoyed rights and protections that seem almost miraculous by the standards of the ancient world. The right to participate in government. The right to own property. The right to have their voices heard. The innovations of Athenian democracy were genuinely revolutionary. But this freedom for some was built upon the unfreedom of others. Slaves formed a massive portion of the Greek population. Women had almost no political rights. Foreigners were permanently excluded from citizenship. And running through all of these categories, providing the labor and the services and the pleasures that made citizen life possible, were those at the very bottom, including the concubines. Male concubines occupied a particularly strange position in this hierarchy. They were often expected to participate in intimate aspects of their patron's life, to be present at gatherings, to engage in activities that might seem to imply a kind of closeness. But this proximity to power did not translate into any power of their own. In fact, it might have made things worse, because the intimacy created uncomfortable questions. If a man treated his concubine with affection, was he treating property as a person? If a concubine gained influence over his patron, was he overstepping his place? The very closeness of the relationship highlighted the contradiction at its heart, and Greek society dealt with this contradiction through shame. The patron was not shamed for keeping a concubine, but the concubine was shamed for being one. This allowed the system to continue without forcing anyone to confront its fundamental injustice. The shame landed on those who had no power to challenge it. The powerful were protected from having to examine their own behavior. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Systems of exploitation are maintained not just through force but through ideology, through stories that justify what would otherwise be unjustifiable. The Greeks told themselves that pederasty was educational, that concubinage was a necessary accommodation for human desire, that slaves were naturally suited to their condition. These stories served a purpose. They allowed people who saw themselves as moral, who valued philosophy and ethics and the pursuit of virtue, to participate in profound cruelty without cognitive dissonance. And that might be the most disturbing lesson of all. Let me now turn to how this system evolved over time. Because ancient Greece was not static. It changed over centuries. And so did the practice of male concubinage. In the archaic and classical periods, when the city-states were at their height, male concubinage existed within a framework of pederastic ideology. The fiction of mentorship, however thin, provided a kind of cover. Relationships were supposed to end when the younger partner reached adulthood. There were supposed to be rules about what was and was not appropriate. These rules were often violated. The ideology was often a lie. But it existed. And its existence at least created the possibility of judgment. A man who too obviously treated his eromenos as property, rather than protege, could face social disapproval. But as the classical period gave way to the Hellenistic age, things changed. Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world, and the old city-state system collapsed. In its place rose vast kingdoms ruled by Macedonian successors. In this new world, the pretense began to fall away. Hellenistic rulers kept harems of boys alongside their wives. Eunuchs gained political power as royal favorites. The educational fiction of pederasty was abandoned in favor of naked exploitation of beauty and youth. This moment represents a shift in Greek attitudes toward male concubinage. The practice became both more visible and more extreme. The philosophical justifications that had previously softened its appearance simply disappeared. What remained was power and desire, unmediated by any pretense of higher purpose. And then came Rome. The Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, absorbing Greek culture even as they dominated Greek territory. And they adopted many Greek practices, including the keeping of male concubines. But the Romans did so without the Greek philosophical framework. A Roman master might keep a young male slave for sexual purposes, but he wouldn't write poetry about the nobility of their love. It was pure dominance without the Greek pretense of educational mentorship. In some ways this was more honest. The exploitation was not dressed up in philosophical language. But in other ways, it was even more brutal. There was not even the fiction of care. Medical texts from this period reveal a horrifying dimension of what concubines experienced. Roman and Greek physicians wrote about treating the physical damage common among boy prostitutes and concubines. Injuries, infections, what we would now recognize as sexually transmitted diseases, were endemic. These weren't love stories. They were accounts of absolute power destroying young lives. And so the practice continued, evolving but never disappearing, until the rise of Christianity began to change the moral landscape of the ancient world. Christian writers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome strongly condemned concubinage in all its forms. Emperor Justinian's legal codes attempted to grant concubines and their children certain property and inheritance rights. Slowly, over centuries, the practice declined. But it did not disappear because of some moral awakening. It declined because the social and economic conditions that supported it changed. Because Christianity replaced paganism. Because the Roman Empire fell and new societies emerged with different values and structures. The boys and men who had suffered for centuries in this system did not see justice. They simply faded into history, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged. And now I want to bring this all together and ask what we should take from this dark chapter of history. First, we must resist the temptation to either romanticize or demonize the ancient Greeks. They were human beings, with all the complexity that implies. They created genuine beauty and genuine wisdom. They also participated in genuine cruelty. Both of these things are true, and acknowledging one does not require denying the other. Second, we should recognize that systems of exploitation are rarely maintained through pure force alone. They require stories, justifications, ideologies that explain why the suffering of some is acceptable or even necessary for the flourishing of others. The Greeks had such stories, and those stories allowed otherwise thoughtful, ethical people to participate in a system that caused immense harm. Third, we should remember the silenced voices. The boys and young men whose names we will never know, whose experiences were never recorded, who lived and suffered and died without anyone thinking their perspective was worth preserving. They existed. They mattered. And our acknowledgement of their existence, however incomplete our knowledge must be, is itself a small act of justice. Fourth, we should look at our own society with clear eyes. What systems do we participate in that future generations will view with horror? What suffering do we justify or ignore because it serves our interests or convenience? The Greeks did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as civilized people living according to the customs of their time. We see ourselves the same way. And finally, we should understand that history is not just about facts and dates. It is about human beings. Real people who loved and feared and hoped and suffered. When we study the ancient world, we are not studying abstractions. We are studying ourselves. Our capacity for both greatness and cruelty. Our ability to justify the unjustifiable. Our tendency to remember the powerful and forget the powerless. The male concubines of ancient Greece had no voice in their own time. But we can give them a voice now. We can tell their stories. We can acknowledge their suffering. We can refuse to let them be erased from history. And that brings me to one last revelation. One final piece of this puzzle that I've been holding back. Remember earlier when I mentioned that court cases survive where men sued each other over access to particular boys? Remember the inheritance documents where boys were listed alongside furniture? Remember the contracts for the rental and sale of concubines? These documents still exist. You can read them if you know where to look. Scholars have translated them. They are part of the historical record. And here's what haunts me. These documents preserve the names. Some of them. Not the names the boys were born with usually, but the names they were called by their owners. The names under which they were bought and sold and rented and inherited. Names without faces. Names without stories. Names that echo across 2,500 years, representing human beings whose lives were reduced to property, whose suffering was documented only in the ledgers of commerce. We cannot give them back their lives. We cannot undo what was done to them, but we can remember. We can bear witness. We can refuse to look away. And that is why this story matters. Not as ancient gossip, not as salacious detail from a bygone era, but as a reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and as a challenge to be better. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about the ancient world, or about the patterns of history, then I have a favor to ask. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me what part resonated most. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden truths of history, the stories that textbooks leave out, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because this is just the beginning. In the next video, I will be exploring another chapter of history that has been deliberately concealed. Another story of power and suffering, and the systematic erasure of voices. And I promise you it will change how you see the world. Until then, remember, history is not what happened. It is what we choose to remember.